Are tariffs a relic of the past? Something from like a dusty history book? Or can they actually bring back jobs and, revitalize American industries in our globalized world, like some people say they can? Or maybe they're just kind of like a sneaky way to raise prices for everyone, kind of benefiting just a select few. Well, in this deep dive, we're going to tackle the whole tariff thing. We'll dig into the history of tariffs in America. We'll dissect, the impacts of those big tariffs back in 2018, and we'll try to sort out if they're a valuable tool or just a political weapon, especially in today's interconnected world. So to kick things off, let's rewind the clock. Let's go way back to America's early days. Back in the 19th century, tariffs were like the financial engine of the U.S. economy. I mean, they generated a mind-blowing 90% of federal income, which basically meant there was no need for income tax until 1910. Yeah, can you imagine that? Yeah. No income tax until 1910. But these tariffs weren't just about bringing in money. They actually played like a huge role in shaping America's industrial landscape. Think about Alexander Hamilton, founding father, the guy on the $10 bill. He was like a major proponent of supporting homegrown industries. And he saw tariffs as this shield, like a way to protect these young American businesses from being overwhelmed by cheap goods from Europe. And you know what? To a certain extent, it worked. A lot of industries in the U.S., they thrived under this protectionist umbrella. But like most things, there was a flip side. The South, which was really dependent on exporting agricultural products, things like cotton and tobacco, they really felt the sting. You see, Europe retaliated with their own tariffs. They slapped tariffs on those southern exports, and that squeezed the South's profits and fueled resentment towards the North. I mean, this tension over tariffs actually contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. Now let's fast forward. We're jumping ahead to the aftermath of World War II. The U.S. emerged from the war as like this global economic powerhouse, and it kind of naturally became a champion of free trade. Technology was advancing, global supply chains were emerging, and this all made trade, well, more efficient, more interconnected. But this whole era of free trade, it hit a snag in 2018. The U.S. kind of ironically imposed some pretty hefty tariffs on China, their biggest trading partner. And this move actually gave us a real-time case study on the effects of tariffs. And one of the most studied examples is what happened with washing machines. So in 2018, the U.S. slapped these tariffs on imported washing machines. The idea was to protect domestic manufacturers, like Whirlpool. But guess what happened? Prices went up. And not just for the imported machines. American-made washing machines got more expensive too. And even dryers, which weren't even targeted by the tariffs, saw their prices jump. It's like this classic example of what economists call dead weight loss. Basically, a tax ends up creating these inefficiencies in the market, and consumers get hit harder than producers benefit. And the Federal Reserve did some research. They found that consumers ended up paying way more than the actual tariff revenue that was collected. It was essentially a hidden tax, adding billions to the cost of appliances. Now, what about those jobs? The ones that tariffs were supposed to create. Well, the washing machine industry did add around 1,800 new jobs. But get this, the cost per job was an astronomical $815,000 per year. So if job creation isn't like a sure thing, what are the long-term effects of these tariffs? To figure that out, let's look at a different industry and a much older tariff. We're talking about the 25% tariff on light trucks. This one was imposed way back in 1964. Now, this tariff, it probably helped protect the U.S. auto industry, but it also stifled competition. With fewer players in the game, there wasn't much incentive to innovate, or improve efficiency. And because of that, American consumers probably paid higher prices for trucks and SUVs. And they might have missed out on some cool new features and fuel efficiency improvements, those things that come with increased competition. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Mercedes-Benz, the German automaker, they decided to get a little clever with the tariff situation. In 2006, they set up shop in South Carolina. Seemed like they were giving in to the pressure of the truck tariff. But there's a twist. They came up with this ingenious plan. They would disassemble their vans in Germany, ship the parts over to the U.S., and then reassemble them here. They totally sidestepped that 25% tariff on imported trucks. This loophole, it shows you how companies can adapt and find ways to work around trade barriers. And it was just Mercedes when the U.S. went after China with tariffs in 2018. A bunch of companies just shifted their production. They moved to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico where the tariffs didn't apply. Some even got into relabeling and repackaging their products. They would route them through other countries just to dodge those import taxes. It just goes to show how resilient and adaptable businesses can be in a globalized world. But all of this brings up a pretty fundamental question. Why might tariffs not be as effective today, as they were back in the 19th century? Well, the world was a completely different place back then. Transportation and communication were slow, products were simpler, and domestic labor was often cheaper. Today, we have these incredibly complex and specialized global supply chains. The components for a single product, they might come from like dozens of countries. Each country with its own advantages in terms of cost, expertise, or regulations. It'd be really difficult and expensive to try and untangle those global supply chains and bring manufacturing back to the U.S. on a massive scale. It's kind of like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube, right? Instead of actually revitalizing domestic industries, tariffs might just end up shifting wealth, taking it from consumers and giving it to the government without really creating those much desired jobs or economic benefits. So are tariffs totally obsolete in today's world? Not necessarily. They can still be a useful tool, but they need to be used with more precision and strategy. Those broad sweeping tariffs like the ones during the Trump administration, they can have a lot of unintended consequences, like triggering higher input costs, fueling inflation, and even sparking retaliatory measures from other countries. It ends up hurting everyone involved. It's kind of like using a chainsaw to prune a bonsai tree. Instead of going for that blunt force approach, tariffs should be more targeted, carefully implemented. And you had to give industries time to adjust. Remember Alexander Hamilton? He got it. He knew you needed a gradual approach. He didn't just slam the door on foreign goods. He gave domestic industries the space to develop and compete over time. But even in this super interconnected world we live in now, there are times when tariffs might be necessary, even if it costs us economically. And that leads us to the geopolitical argument for tariffs, which we'll dig into next. As global tensions heat up, countries are starting to get a little nervous. They're realizing that maybe they've become a bit too reliant on other countries for some pretty important stuff, especially if those other countries aren't exactly the best of friends. It's kind of like lending your house keys to someone you don't totally trust. And a good example of this is semiconductors. There's those tiny little chips that are basically the brains behind everything. I mean, our smartphones, our computers, even fighter jets, they all run on these things. And the U.S. imports a lot of its semiconductors from Taiwan, but Taiwan's facing some serious pressure from China. So this dependence, it's making people a bit uneasy. It raises some real concerns about national security and economic vulnerability. What if there's a conflict? Then there's energy. Europe's been heavily dependent on Russia for natural gas. And that's become a huge problem with the war in Ukraine. It's a wake-up call, Yeah. Being overly reliant on one supplier can have some pretty serious consequences, not just economically, but politically too. And food. We can't forget about food. The pandemic really showed us how fragile global food supply chains can be. Lockdowns, border closures, all of that led to shortages and prices went through the roof. And this vulnerability is making countries think twice about this whole free trade thing when it comes to essentials. Stuff like food, medicine, and those critical raw materials. Some countries are even starting to see tariffs as a way to kind of shield their key industries, and become less reliant on countries that might not be so reliable or that they don't really see eye to eye with. It's like this balancing act. They're trying to weigh the benefits of global trade against the strategic need to be more self-sufficient. It's a tough situation. It's almost like walking a tightrope between two skyscrapers. One false step, and it could all come crashing down. But here's the catch. While tariffs might offer some protection in the short term, they can also backfire. They could end up raising costs for consumers, stifling innovation, and triggering these retaliatory measures from other countries. So you could end up hurting the very industries you were trying to protect. So how do we make sense of all of this? How do we balance the good stuff about global trade with the need to be resilient, especially with all this uncertainty in the world? Well, one way is to use tariffs more strategically, be more selective, focus on industries that are crucial for national security, or where it's really important to have domestic production. Like maybe the U.S. could justify tariffs on things like semiconductors or those rare earth minerals, the stuff that's vital for high-tech industries and defense. Another approach is to invest in innovation and manufacturing here at home, reduce our reliance on those foreign suppliers over time. Maybe the government could offer support for research and development, or give tax breaks to companies that move production back to the U.S. And investing in worker training and education would be huge. But even tariffs and domestic investment might not be enough on their own. We also need to work on strengthening international cooperation, and making our supply chains more diverse so we're not so reliant on just one country. Maybe that means making new trade agreements with friendly nations, promoting fair trade practices, or working together to tackle global problems like climate change and pandemics. Those things can really mess up supply chains. So as we grapple with all of this, I think the important thing to remember is that tariffs aren't some magical solution. They're just a tool. And just like any tool, they can be used well or poorly, for good or for bad. The trick is to use them wisely. Make sure you understand what the costs and benefits might be, and always keep the long-term interests of our economy and our country in mind. So where does all of this leave us? We've gone from, America's early days of protectionism, then to the rise of global trade, and now we're back to tariffs making a comeback, though maybe in a, slightly more strategic and nuanced way. But the truth is, there isn't a simple answer when it comes to tariffs. Are they good? Are they bad? It's complicated. They can help the economy grow, or they can be used as like a weapon. They can protect industries here at home, or they can punish competitors in other countries. They can bolster national security, or they can, undermine global cooperation. It really depends. I think the big takeaway here is that in today's world, with everything so interconnected, tariffs, they aren't a quick fix. They need to be thought through carefully, implemented strategically, and we got to be ready to adapt as the world changes. Global trade and geopolitics, they're always evolving. So as you keep learning about this stuff, I'd encourage you to really think about some of these questions. What role should tariffs play in how we run our economy? How do we balance the good parts of free trade with the need to be secure and resilient as a nation? Is there a middle ground? A sweet spot somewhere between protectionism and globalization? These are tough questions. There aren't any easy answers, but they're questions we really need to grapple with as we face all the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Keep digging, keep learning, and most importantly, keep those questions coming, because the world of economics, well, it's always full of surprises.